Your Excellency, Mr. President, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I was greatly looking forward to being with you in Reykjavik, a city which always fascinates me. And of course, the President of your country, if I may make the claim without his taking offense, is a great friend of mine. He's been a wonderful friend, a great supporter, and a visionary that I think the whole world respects and admires. So I'm particularly sorry not to be able to make it on this occasion. However, I'm very grateful for this opportunity to say a few words and present a few findings of the IPCC's work, which I hope will be relevant in your discussions. Let me start by going to the first slide, which clearly gives you the findings that have come out in the recently released Working Group 1 report of the 5th assessment report of the IPCC. And the evidence since the 1950s is very clear. The atmosphere and the oceans have warmed, the amounts of snow and ice have diminished, sea level has risen, the concentrations of greenhouse gases have increased, and what is particularly important is the fact that each of the last 3 decades has been successfully warmer at the Earth's surface than any preceding decade since 1850. So the Earth is warming, and I think it is absolutely clear that there is no question of this particular trend having gone downwards or having slowed or whatever. Let me go to the next slide. It's also very important to remember that the oceans have been absorbing a large part of the heat that has been generated as a result of climate change, so much so that between 0 to 700 meters in the depth of the upper parts of the ocean, since 1971 and up to 2010, there has been, with virtual certainty, a warming of the oceans. The rate of sea level rise since the mid-19th century has been larger than the mean rate during the previous 2 millennia. And over the period 1901 to 2010, there has been sea level rise of 19 centimeters. Now, it's important to remember that ocean warming dominates the increase in energy stored in the climate system, accounting for more than 90% of the energy accumulated between 1971 and 2010. Let me go to the next slide, which deals with the polar regions, and it says very clearly that polar regions are increasingly recognized as being geopolitically and economically important. I mean, the whole world is now looking at what's going to happen with marine activity and shipping that might take place in that part of the world. And it's extremely vulnerable to current and projected climate change. As you know, the Arctic is warming at twice the rate of the rest of the planet, and regions with the greatest potential to affect global climate and thus human populations and biodiversity. The changes in the climate in the Arctic are not going to remain confined only to that region. They have a profound impact on the climate in the rest of the globe. And the sub-regions of the Arctic and Antarctic have shown the most rapid rates of warming in recent years. Let me go to the next slide, which gives you observed changes in the climate system in respect of the last 2 decades, where the Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets have been losing mass. Glaciers have continued to shrink almost worldwide, and the Arctic sea ice and northern hemisphere spring snow cover have continued to decrease in extent. And you can see this in the 2 graphs over here, the upper one showing the northern hemisphere spring snow cover, and the lower one Arctic summer sea ice extent, which has gone down very sharply, as is obvious. And since the early 1970s, glacier mass loss as well as thermal expansion of the oceans has accounted for 75% of the global mean sea level rise which has taken place. I go now to the next slide, which gives you an increase in atmospheric CO2, and it clearly indicates that human influence on the climate system is unequivocal. It also indicates, as the caption at the bottom says, it's extremely likely that human influence has been the dominant cause of the observed warming since the mid-20th century. And when we use the term extremely likely, we are assigning a probability of over 95%, which incidentally is an increase over the findings in the fourth assessment report, where we use the term very likely, representing 90% or more. The next two slides basically give you projections of sea level rise and temperature increases in the 21st century. The very first of these two indicates that sea level rise could be almost 1 meter by the end of this century. And of course, this is dependent on the four scenarios that have been used. Clearly, if we don't make any efforts to mitigate emissions of greenhouse gases and radiative forcing is at a high level, then clearly sea level rise would be substantially higher. So, it also indicates that it's very likely that the Arctic sea ice cover will continue to shrink and thin as global mean surface temperature rises. And global mean sea level will of course continue to rise during the 21st century. The next slide, which gives you warming in terms of temperature increase, for each of the scenarios that we have used, you get an indication of the increase in temperature that is likely to take till the end of the 21st century. And particularly for scenarios RCP 6.0 and RCP 8.5, we are likely to exceed the temperature of 2 degrees Celsius by far. The next slide is basically taken from findings drawn from the fourth assessment report, and this gives you key future impacts and vulnerabilities, and these extend to food availability, personal safety, because extreme events are going to increase, including heat waves as well as extreme precipitation events, and all of these represent a risk to life and property. Warming and thawing of the permafrost will bring detrimental effects on community infrastructure, because clearly with the foundation weakening as a result of warming of the permafrost, whatever infrastructure you create would be on a very flimsy foundation. And the benefits of a less severe climate are dependent on local conditions, but could include reduced heating costs and so on. So these are some of the benefits, if you please, that might take place in some parts of the world. I go to the next slide, which talks about the role and limits of adaptation. We have no choice, given the inertia in the system, that we will encounter climate change for several decades in the future, and there will be impacts of climate change, as a result of which human society will have to adapt to these impacts. But of course, we know that adaptation alone is not likely to cope with all the projected effects of climate change, and therefore we would also have to make sure that we mitigate emissions of greenhouse gases. Let me go to the next slide, which just lists some of the adaptation measures that are relevant in the Arctic region. Arctic communities, of course, have been adapting to climate change for a long period of time, but external and internal stresses challenge this adaptive capacity, and adaptation will be ineffective in some cases, such as natural ecosystems. This would occur as a result of loss of Arctic sea ice and marine ecosystem viability. And benefits associated with climate change will be regionally specific and widely variable at different locations. What we need to do is to ensure that there's enough information dissemination, education, and creation of local institutional capacity by which communities can adapt to the impacts of climate change. However, it's important for us to remember that we would need both adaptation and mitigation, because one or the other will not be able to meet the challenge of climate change. And while adaptation is essentially a local challenge, I think mitigation of emissions of greenhouse gases has to be on the basis of a global effort. And I think the time has come when we must realize the importance of both these sets of measures, because clearly some of the most vulnerable regions of the world, of which the Arctic is certainly one, would have to deal with totally unprecedented levels of climate change, and therefore impacts that would also be quite unprecedented. So finally, let's make use of knowledge that's available. Let's make use of all the scientific information provided by the IPCC by mobilizing the best scientists from all over the world, hundreds and thousands of them who are involved. And this would really bear testimony to what Einstein very rightly said, as shown in the final slide. Problems cannot be solved at the same level of awareness that created them. And therefore, if out of ignorance we have created a major problem for human society, for all living species on this planet, we now have the benefit of knowledge on the basis of which we can carry out both adaptation and mitigation and deal with this growing challenge of climate change. Thank you very much. And once again, Mr. President, thank you for inviting me. I apologize for not being able to make it, but I shall come to Reykjavik as soon as possible. It would be a great privilege and pleasure to spend time with you and all the distinguished officials of the government of Iceland. Thank you very much.